Madam President, I rise this afternoon to talk about the recession, unemployment, job loss, all of those related topics, and in a very particular way to focus on the trauma, the suffering that a lot of Pennsylvanians, a lot of Americans are living through right now. This has been and continues to be a horrific recession for the American people. And when you have that, when we're confronted with that kind of economic difficulty, we need to respond to that in very bold ways. I think we have over the last couple of years and even the last couple of weeks. I'll talk about that today. But we do need a bold action to put people back to work and to keep our economy moving in the right direction, as I think it is now, more than a year after the recovery bill was enacted. In Pennsylvania, the unemployment situation is as follows. Our rate is about 8.8% as of January. That's lower than a number of states of comparable size. But unfortunately, the rate doesn't really tell you much. It doesn't often reflect the true meaning of the true impact of unemployment. We have 560,000 people in Pennsylvania out of work through no fault of their own. And I think it's also important to put this in the context of where we've been and where we are now, not only in Pennsylvania but across the country. In late December of 2008, Congress took action to stave off the impending collapse of our nation's financial system. Months later, the downturn required Congress to pass, as I mentioned before, the recovery bill, known as the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, known by the acronym ARRA. I tend to refer to it as the recovery bill. These actions were, at the time, meaning the legislative actions, were unpopular, but absolutely necessary. And I said we've worked on job creation strategies and legislation more recently, within the last couple of weeks. Our Majority Leader, Senator Reid, has led us in that, and we're making progress. We have more to do. But first, let me go back in time a little bit to the basic of the fall of 2008. Happened to be a member at that time of the Banking Committee, and we were given briefings at that time on how perilous our financial system was at that moment, that we were really on the edge of a cliff in terms of the collapse of our financial system and therefore the collapse of our economy. We passed legislation which included the Troubled Asset Relief Program, known by the acronym TARP. And I know as soon as I say it, it doesn't bring back positive recollections for people. It was not popular. Even the bill itself was not that popular. The Emergency Economic Stabilization Act. And part of that was the so-called Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. But I think it's important to put facts on the table about what has happened since that time. The Troubled Asset Relief Program was indeed unpopular. But we should note that to date, the Treasury Department has spent, invested, or loaned $500 billion through the TARP program. To date, almost $190 billion of the $500 billion has been returned or paid to the Treasury Department. These actions help steer the economy back from the brink, and by the program's conclusion, we expect all but $100 billion of that $500 billion to be repaid, which makes the Troubled Asset Relief Program significantly less expensive to taxpayers than earlier estimates. And it met some of the predictions at the time by some of us that the money would be paid back. So that's good news. It's not enough, though, to report on good news. We had to take other action. We took action when we passed the recovery bill in the early part of 2009. Just by way of example, Pennsylvania is on track to receive more than $26 billion through the recovery bill, including billions in direct tax relief. We had 4.9 million Pennsylvanians who got tax relief as part of the recovery bill. And part of, I should say, that more than 26 billion, 13.5 billion was in so-called formula-driven funding for health, education, infrastructure, job training, and other aid. A tremendous boost to the economy of Pennsylvania, not only creating jobs, but preventing the erosion of our job creation strategies and preventing people from being laid off. Teachers in school districts, law enforcement officials, and jump-starting the economy of Pennsylvania. We still have a ways to go. We still have basically another year of jump-starting effect for the recovery bill. Across the country, when we measure the impact of the recovery bill, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, known by that acronym CBO, we hear about it all the time, but they're a referee, in a sense, in Washington, an arbiter of what the numbers mean. The CBO reported a few weeks ago that the Recovery Act added between 1 million and 2.1 million jobs by the fourth quarter of 2009. Again, still in process, halfway basically, or almost, I should say, halfway through the recovery bill's implementation at the end of 2009, 1 million to 2 million jobs. The CBO also said that the Recovery Act raised economic growth by 1.5% to 3.5% over that same period. So it's contributed to growth. The CBO director, Doug Elmendorf, said during a recent Joint Economic Committee hearing that, and I quote, "The policies that were enacted," meaning the recovery bill, are, quote, "increasing GDP and employment relative to what it would otherwise be," unquote. So that's the CBO talking about the recovery bill. There's another way to measure it. There are lots of ways to measure the impact, and I would argue the success of it. January, February of 2009, the country lost 1.5 million jobs. January and February a year later, 2010, the job loss, as of the most recent report for February, was a little more than 60,000 jobs, just about 62,000 jobs. So that reduction or diminution in the number of jobs lost from 1.5 million jobs to 62,000 jobs is indeed substantial progress. But again, it's not enough. We have to keep going. We have to keep putting in place strategies to create many, many more jobs. Madam President, I think the facts speak for themselves. More people are currently employed and more goods and services are being produced as a result of the Recovery Act. Put another way, if the Recovery Act was not enacted, the economic situation would be much worse than it is today. I think that's an understatement if we didn't pass that legislation. But we need to do more and move forward. We need to pass legislation to continue to create jobs. That's why I'm standing today in support of passage of the American Workers, State and Business Relief Act, the legislation we're considering right now. This legislation contains vital policies that will support our workers and our businesses as we recover from the recent economic recession. The most important part of the legislation is the extension of unemployment insurance and COBRA health insurance through December 31st of this year. The national unemployment rate of 9.7%, that's what it is now, but it's expected to remain at this level, unfortunately, through most of 2010. I mentioned earlier that in Pennsylvania it's about a point lower, 8.8%, 560,000 Pennsylvanians out of work. These numbers are far too high for us to in any way be satisfied with the positive impact the recovery bill has had and other measures we've taken. We passed, or we're about to pass and enact into law, the HIRE Act. 4 provisions agreed to in a bipartisan way, but we have to do more than that as well. Congress must continue to provide for comprehensive unemployment benefits and a subsidy to pay for COBRA health insurance for those who have lost their job through no fault of their own. The eligibility for emergency unemployment compensation and COBRA premium assistance, that program, will expire at the end of March. According to our state's Department of Labor and Industry, hundreds of thousands of Pennsylvania workers could lose unemployment benefits over the next several months without an extension. An extension of federally funded unemployment compensation and the COBRA health insurance subsidy through the end of this year, December 31, are necessary for several reasons. First of all, state labor departments, I think this is true across the board, will not be under pressure to constantly update their systems and inform constituents of the changes in federal law. Why should we keep passing an extension of a month or 2 or 3, when we could pass legislation to give certainty, most importantly, to that unemployed worker and his or her family. They're the most important. Part of this story, but also to state labor departments and other officials and departments, so they don't have to continue to make changes to their system. People who are recently laid off will constantly be reminded that their unemployment benefits may run out sooner than expected, especially at a time when there are 6 applicants for every 1 job. And finally, in terms of a reason to do this, to extend unemployment and COBRA health insurance, our state labor department also makes a point that at a time when millions of people don't have health care coverage, failure to provide an adequate safety net to ensure that people maintain adequate and affordable health coverage will only add to the rolls of the uninsured in the country. During my travels throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, I've met, and I continue to meet, or I hear from, numerous people who are in desperate need of help. Recently, the Hanlon family of Pleasantville, Pennsylvania, contacted my office to share their story. Here's about one story, but very telling about what families are up against. Lisa and Jeff Hanlon have 4 young children. Until recently, Jeff and Lisa were both employed by the same company. And in their words, quote, "The family lived on a solid middle-class experience," unquote. Jeff worked at the company for nearly 8 years. Over time, he began to experience severe health problems, including suffering three heart attacks. When the economic downturn hit, Jeff was downsized by the company, and the family lost their health insurance. The blow of losing health insurance could not have come at a worse time. Just one of Jeff's hospital bills was $398,000. Due to his medical condition, Jeff was unable to work. Too sick to work, it took a long time for Jeff to apply for and receive Social Security. During this time, the family experienced severe hardship and sold everything of value to be able to keep their home and stay afloat. Mrs. Hanlon told our office that their children went without medical help for a year. Young children going without medical help for a year because their father or mother, someone in their house, loses their job. That's unacceptable. We should say and act upon that statement that that's unacceptable in America today. What the Hanlons had to do was choose what bills to pay to feed their children. Without means, the children were not able to participate in sports or any school activities. Even now, the family's current income is a fraction of what it was. Another example, in addition to the Hanlons, Janet Lee Smith is a single mother of 2 girls. Her difficulties began back in 2003 when she was laid off from a 26-year career. As Janet tells the story, the company began outsourcing to Mexico, which made her position obsolete. Faced with the tremendous responsibility of raising 2 young girls, she decided to go back to school while also working. In 2005, she graduated from a Penn State Extension campus with an associate's degree in human development and family studies. Unfortunately, additional education was not enough to get her a job in this tough economic climate. So once again, Janet turned to odd jobs and part-time jobs until 2008, when she was finally blessed with a full-time job as an administrative assistant. 9 months later, once again, she was told that the business was slow and she would, in her words, and I'm quoting, once again become a statistic as a, quote, dislocated worker, unquote. Today, unable to find full-time work, Janet is back in school and working part-time. She says she feels she has to do whatever she can to, quote, get her girls through school healthy and strong, unquote. Get her girls through school healthy and strong. In Janet's words, it's not, and I'm quoting here again, it's not a good feeling at all being told that you are going to be laid off, especially when you're the only income that your family depends on. It has been a great struggle, I should say, it has been a struggle. keeping up my spirits and trying not to let my girls see that I am stressed, unquote. So that's what Janet tells us, and that's what the Hanlon family tells us. But despite these challenges, and I've seen this across our state, despite these challenges, Janet is still optimistic. She says, and I quote again, "I'm confident that this time I'll be able to find that one job. I know that they're out there. I have had a good job before, and I will have a good job again," unquote. I'm telling you, I've heard this in many instances across our state. I was at a job center in South Central Pennsylvania, just outside of Gettysburg. Met with 8 of those 560,000 people out of work. Heard the same thing there. 8 Pennsylvanians, 6 at least of the 8, over the age of 50, several over the age of 60, never been out of work in their lives, never had to rely upon food stamps, in almost every case, never had to rely upon unemployment insurance, and they find themselves in this predicament. But despite that, there is a burning flame of optimism inside them. Despite their setbacks, they're willing to keep filling out forms, keep applying, keeping their head up and keeping moving forward. Debbie, a woman who was one of those 8 that we spoke to that day, probably said it best. She said very simply, all we want to do is get back to work. And I think you see that across the board. So what are we going to do in Congress? Are we going to preach and say, well, we're only going to have unemployment insurance for another couple weeks or another few months? We're only going to have COBRA health insurance for a couple of months, a couple of weeks. It's very easy for us to say it. We have health care, federal employees that we are. We have job security. So for those who say that shouldn't do it, we shouldn't extend these safety net programs, before you make a speech about it, you should tell your constituents about why you don't want to support it. Tell Janet Smith and tell the Hanlon family why it's not a good idea to support unemployment insurance and COBRA health insurance. The security of Washington allows a lot of people to avoid that conversation. The security of being a federal employee, being a senator or a House member, and having health coverage and job security allows us the luxury of not having to look those families in the eye and tell them. But I think if people were more honest about it around here, they would. So in addition to aiding families who are desperately in need of putting food on the table and a roof over their heads, an extension of the unemployment insurance has a direct impact on our nation's economy. We know, for example, again, the Congressional Budget Office says that for every $1 spent on unemployment insurance benefits, upwards of $1.90 is contributed to the gross domestic product. Mark Zandi, an economist I've quoted often, a Pennsylvanian, I realize I'm a little biased there, but he's also had worked on Senator McCain's presidential campaign, so not someone coming from a purely Democratic point of view. Mark Zandi has stated that for every $1 spent on unemployment insurance benefits, upwards of $1.63 is contributed to gross domestic product. So you spend $1 on unemployment insurance, taxpayers get $1.63 back in return. But in addition to unemployment insurance and COBRA health insurance, the American Workers State and Business Relief Act provides a range of tax credits that will help businesses and state governments to create and retain jobs. For example, the bill contains an extension of the biodiesel fuel credit, which will put a number of Pennsylvanians back to work and across the country. The bill contains a research and development tax credit, which will provide businesses the financial resources to compete in a global marketplace. And finally, Madam President, the bill will assist our teachers by providing a tax deduction for those teachers that spend their own money to buy supplies for their classrooms and students. Something I've seen in Pennsylvania for many, many years. Teachers constantly reaching into their own pocket to buy supplies and equipment and things that they need in order for them to teach our children. So, Madam President, I'll say in conclusion that I, and I know many others, strongly support passage of the American Workers State and Business Relief Act. This legislation is necessary to continue to spur economic growth and create jobs in Pennsylvania and across our country. And with that, Madam President, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.